We're so glad you can join us this evening. My name is Mary Ann Mead, and it's my honor to work here at the Southwest Harbor Public Library. I want to take this opportunity to thank the countless community members here and from away for supporting the library. We truly couldn't offer the services and programs that we do without your support. So when I say thank you all so very much, I mean it from the bottom of my heart. Now, before I introduce this evening's guests, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this event. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them to the Q&A or chat feature, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So now it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Christina Baker Kline and Lincoln Millstein. Christina is the best-selling author of 8 novels, including The Exiles, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World, and she's published in 40 countries. Her novels have received the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, and a Barnes & Noble Discover Award, among other prizes, and have been chosen by hundreds of communities, universities, and schools as one book, one read selections. Christina is a longtime friend and supporter of the library. She's spoken here several times and has even sat as a model on one occasion. We couldn't love her more. Joining Christina this evening is Lincoln Millstein, another friend and supporter of the library. Lincoln is the author of the Quietside Journal, a blog about news and happenings on the southern part of Mount Desert Island. He has been coming here since 1984 and recently became a permanent resident upon his retirement from the Hearst Corporation. He worked for the New York Times Company in the early 2000s, and before that, he worked at the Boston Globe for 17 years. He worked there while he worked there, he held several editing positions: city editor, business editor, and managing editor for features where he oversaw cultural coverage. And in August of this year, he wrote a wonderful review of The Exiles, which appeared in Hearst newspapers and magazines. He's also, as you can see behind him, a musician and can be heard often performing at the Common Good Cafe. The library and the town of Southwest Harbor are extremely fortunate to have these two wonderful people in our midst. Welcome, Christina and Lincoln.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a delight to be here.
So I just want to give you a little bit backstory on how I met Christina. I started writing my blog in April. And by the way, Christina and I both have been here since March with our families. I think we both came up here planning to stay maybe a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I thought 10 days at the most, March 13th.
Right, and we're still here. So I started writing this blog, and in April, the library shut down, and I asked E-Rich, I said, people are borrowing books remotely online. And I said, can you send me a list of your bestsellers? The most popular books online. And he sent me his top 5. And the first 2 were Christina. And then E-Rich also wrote and said, she's a neighbor of yours. And I said, what? I had no idea that Christina has a long history here in Maine. And in fact, it's only a couple of miles from where I live. So that's that. So I wrote her publicist and I said, I'd love to write about her for my blog, and could you introduce us? So that's how we first connected. And then I got the book in advance and I read it and I wrote the reviews. So that's sort of the backstory. The thing that's different about tonight's session is that it's really a conversation with our neighbors, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
It's unlike a lot of the sessions that you did with Sanibel or anyone else. So we got to be careful what we say tonight, because people are apt to button us and on the street and say, "Did you really say that the other night?"
Exactly.
So
Or they might say it in the chat tonight.
we're talking with neighbors. So Christina, now I looked at your calendar. I went on your website and looked at your calendar, and you've been doing this since August 25th.
Yeah, long time. I know.
Right. So are you, I mean, talk about, this is such an unusual year where you're not doing a tour.
Right.
And so you've been doing this for more than 6 weeks now. Is there a fatigue that sets in? What's different about, what are the pros and cons of doing this online instead of doing a tour?
Gosh, I mean, it's fantastic to be here in Maine and to get to talk to people like you, Lincoln. I mean, one of the joys of doing a Zoom tour that seems to be endless and ongoing is getting to talk to people I admire, whom I otherwise would not be in the same city with. So that has been lovely. You know, like Lily King is in Portland and Monica Wood also. And I was able to do virtual events with both of them. Richard Russo, a bunch of Maine people actually, Claire Massoud in Boston, and then people in Seattle. I'm like pointing as if there's Seattle over there. All over, actually all over the world. I've done events with, let's see, Jean Kwok is in Amsterdam and Heather Morris is in Melbourne, Australia. So that's been great. What's weird is not seeing people in person. Like I can see that there are people here, but they're not visible to me, and that's very strange. It's lovely to have these one-on-one conversations, but it's different without an audience. It feels very different.
Especially if the event is in Hawaii, which,
Yes.
right, which
Yes.
you will not be able to go to this year.
Right, Hawaii and Sanibel, there are all these writers' conferences that we're doing online instead, so, which is very strange. And I just want to say, I know we already talked about this, but if you have if you have comments or questions as we go, just write them in the chat, because it's sort of helpful to us if there are things that come up that you want to know more about, or if you have questions that we're not addressing. So please do.
So this is a special treat, and I've had maybe a half dozen opportunities in my career to interview artists and writers after I've actually read their book, or actually after I've actually seen their art. So it's a very special treat. Now, one of the things I know about Christina and the Exile is her intense research that she does in a book. And I want you to talk to us a little bit about the research behind the Exiles.
Okay. Gosh, Lincoln, when you're talking, I was just thinking, we have to do this again, but I get to interview you. I mean, I have so many questions for you about research as well, and your own work and body of work. Not to mention the Quietside Journal, which I devour the minute it appears every time, including today with breaking news, my goodness. So a number of people in this community know my father, William Baker, who was quite involved with the MDI Historical Society. He's a historian, taught at the University of Maine for many years, chaired the history department there, has written a dozen books, or maybe even more, I'm not sure. I think he's writing, I know he's writing one now, and he's 80, going on 85. And so when I started writing novels, I thought I had nothing in common with my historian father. And even my mother, who also wrote 2 books, and but nonfiction. So I wrote novels. Nobody else in my family wrote novels. And I thought, okay, that's really different. what I've discovered in my last 3 novels, which are set in the past, is that my methodology and research style, and even the way I put words on paper, are exactly like my father. So I think I absorbed a lot of his rigor in the quest of, in his case, factual books that with reams of endnotes and footnotes. I remember him doing those, that incredibly laborious job of tracking everything down. And in fact, one of my most interesting conversations was with Eric Larson, because he writes popular nonfiction. His most recent book is incredible, The Splendid and the Vile, about Churchill, but he doesn't make up anything. I mean, it reads like fiction, but he heavily researches, of course, and also keeps track of absolutely everything. So he was explaining to me how he does it, that he has a manuscript that's, he assigns numbers to all his sources, 1 through however many, 1,000, and then puts a number after each sentence. And that's one manuscript. And then the next version just wipes out the numbers, but he always has that with all of his sources. And even though I write fiction, for these books that are set in the past, I felt a real responsibility to be factually accurate as much as I could. So I wasn't quite that meticulous, but I can tell you where almost everything came from on each page of my book. At the same time, you know, you're telling a story, you want it to be entertaining, you want it to be compelling, you want it to grab people and pull people in. And so I had to be really ruthless with myself about cutting back on all the research that didn't fit, that didn't have anything to do with my story. Or I mean, it did have to do with my story, but it wasn't directly relevant. So what I finally came to is that if my character doesn't see, hear, touch, taste, in other words, experience this thing that I'm describing, then it doesn't belong in the book, even if it feels pretty interesting to me. So there's another whole book to be written about all the research I did that didn't end up in the book. But a lot of it, you know, a lot of it did. And I researched a lot before I started writing. And then as I started working, I discovered that there was lots more to learn. So, you know, there are these small details, like, for example, my character gets into a taxi in London. What is a taxi in London in 1840 or in 1865 when I also describe, well, it's how many horses, it's pulled by horses, right? So how many horses pull it? What color is it? What's the interior like? You know, all those things. I always think of, I think I've said this before, because I always think about this when I'm writing novels, but there's this classic children's book called Harold and the Purple Crayon. And Harold has to draw his way into his own narrative. And so he can't open a door without drawing a doorknob. And then he goes through the door and he can't sit down until he draws the chair. And I sort of think of that as I'm crafting a story, that I'm slowly building these pieces to especially a story set in the past, to make it come to life.
So, you know, I don't want to assume anything on this call, because I'm already assuming a lot of people on the call have read The Exiles, and
oh yeah,
and I shouldn't assume that. All right. So the story about 3 women, 2 of whom are prisoners from England, and one is an Aboriginal girl in Australia. And this is about I think an 80-year period where England was shipping prisoners to Australia. But just to give you a feel of how the research touched me, that's a long trip from England to Australia. I think they're on the ocean 4 months, and I actually spent 21 days on a ship once, going across the Pacific on a small transport, and I felt the rolling seas in your book. And because when you're sailing on a ship in the ocean, like the Pacific Ocean or the Indian Ocean or whatever, the swells are so enormous that the ship is never still.
Right.
And in the period in the book where you described that voyage, I never felt like I was still.
Yeah.
And so now there's something that you've researched to describe that period.
Yeah,
Which
definitely.
on the book.
I hope it's not invasive if I ask you, but we've had lunch together, socially distanced at SIPS. And am I right that you're talking about a period when you were young and came to America?
That's right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
how old were you again when you came from?
I was 11.
Right.
On the ship going to Honolulu, actually, where my mother got naturalized as an American citizen. But we left Taiwan and went up to Korea and all the way down to Honolulu. It was a 21-day trip on the ocean. And so I understood and felt the rolling seas as they were going on that 4-month journey from England.
Yeah. I mean, I've never been on a cruise. I mean, I know cruises are very different than these repurposed slaving ships that they used then, or I'm sure the craft that you came over on as well. But most of us who grew up in Maine have been on boats, certainly, and out in choppy water. So I had some sense of that. And I've been seasick. I think many of us have been seasick. So I had that frame of reference, but I read lots of accounts. It was such a brutal journey, 4 to 6 months. And in the early years, a lot of people died. And eventually, the ships got a little better and the voyage got a little shorter, but reading about what it felt like to be, especially in the bowels of the ship, the orlop deck, it's called, at the very bottom, which is where, of course, where these women, these prisoners, these convicts were kept, and they were locked in at night, and it was dark and it was crowded. Their bunks were 18 inches wide and they were piled on top of each other in these very close bunk beds. So it just was not pleasant. And I did want to convey that. I think for those of you who haven't read the book, and I hope, Lincoln, you would agree with this, I describe sort of a brutal story in a lot of ways, but what I wanted to come through was this is a book about finding community in the midst of great stress and difficulty, and that ultimately it was the fact that these people found each other that that ended up sort of pulling them through. And not all of them make it, and it's complicated, but as I read convict stories over and over again, especially for the women, I was reading women's stories. I'd read some men's stories before, but there were very strong friendships forged. And I think I also took that away from an experience I had teaching in a women's prison. I taught twice, once at the Bangor jail when I was in my 20s, and then again as an adult, I taught at the only all-female women's prison in New Jersey called the Edna Mahan facility. 700 inmates, 300 in maximum security, 100 in supermax. And I taught the women who were in supermax, I was teaching creative writing, memoir writing. And that was a profoundly life-changing experience for me. And I originally had actually thought about writing about that time with those women. And I had a great title, which was At the End of Freedom Road, because believe it or not, the road to the prison is actually called Freedom Road, which is cruel, either cruel or ironic, I'm not sure. And I had tons of notes. So I didn't end up doing that, but I did use my notes when I was writing this book about incarceration and the feelings that people have about it. And one of the things that really struck me when I was teaching there is that people create, I mean, this is so self-evident, I suppose, but I don't know what I was thinking going into supermax, where many of these women were never going to get out of prison. was it bleak? Yeah, in some ways, yes, of course it was bleak, but you make a life wherever you live. That's something that I really learned in that experience, that these women had moments of great joy. They had really strong friendships. They laughed, they sang, they did art and crafts. And I mean, you know, so seeing that sort of human spirit there was really profoundly important to me as I wrote this book.
So I've been a boater about 45 years now, and I had no idea what an orlop deck was.
Yeah.
Okay, so this book drove me to Google many, many times. And Angels of Trumpet, I had no idea what Angels of Trumpet was. Is that the name of it? Angels of Trumpet?
Angel's Trumpet. Angel's
Right.
Trumpet.
Angels Trumpet.
But you can see, if you do fact check the book, you can see it's all true.
I wasn't fact checking. I just wanted to learn more about what I was reading. And,
Yeah.
And I thought that was a good thing. I was not trying to validate.
No, I'm not. I don't think you were. I'm just saying I think people are always surprised when they Google Angel's Trumpet and are like, oh, that's actually a real thing. It sounds sort of made up. When I was in Tasmania doing research for the book, this plant was everywhere. And people were like, yeah, oh, it's deadly. And here it is by my front door, you know? So I found that really interesting. And when I came up with this character of Hazel, who uses her powers of healing and her knowledge of medicines, et cetera, for good and ill, I thought it totally made sense to use that plant, and it would have made sense then to do so.
So I went back and took a look at some of your previous interviews, the one with Greer McAllister and with Lily King. I love Lily King.
Yeah,
but in one of them, I don't remember which one, somebody asked you about research, and you said that each book is the hardest project for you. And so I was a little surprised by that. I mean, you've now written more than a dozen books, both nonfiction and fiction. You haven't picked up any repeatable patterns that you can take advantage of, and you start from scratch every time?
You know, here's what's easier. I know I can, or at least have written a book. I know that that's possible for me to do. At the beginning, I wasn't so sure that that was something I could even pull off. But I remember, you know, Piece of the World, every book is different. Every book is hard in a different way. And Piece of the World, which is about Christina Olson, I remember turning to my husband when I had maybe 250 pages of it and saying, I don't think I can pull this off. I don't think this is ever going to be a book. I don't know how I can continue this. I was so flummoxed by it. It was so hard, that book. Every sentence was hard won because I was writing about real people, Andrew Wyeth, and the subject of his best known painting, Christina Olson. Christina's World is the painting. And I was sort of, and some of them are still alive, Jamie and Nikki, the brothers, the Wyeth children, and other people. And it was terrifying. And I was taking a lot on that I had to learn a lot about. And I've done that, especially with these last 3 books, taken on worlds that were completely unknown to me when I started. So I think I keep setting myself these challenges that are daunting. I'm not writing in the same universe each time. So writing about Australia and in particular writing about Aboriginal people was really complicated. I did an event with Heather Morris. She's the one I mentioned who lives in Melbourne. And she wrote The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which is this enormous mega bestseller. Actually, I reviewed it for the Times, and it was just random that she ended up interviewing me for this thing we did. But she said right at the beginning that she picked up the book with trepidation and was very skeptical. She was afraid that I didn't know anything about Australia, didn't know what I was talking about, especially about Indigenous people. And But she ended up loving it, and she even just wrote about it in this big national magazine. So I was very happy to hear that. International, I guess. But I was terrified about many aspects of this story as I was working on it, and about about who has the right to tell what story. So it's a tough one.
So here's something that I was really surprised to learn. You write your books by longhand. You write it, what, pen on paper?
Yeah.
Are you kidding?
I was gonna pull it, show you, but yes, I write longhand. You know, I'm not the only novelist. Everybody thinks it's so weird, but I have a lot of friends who write longhand. I do. I need the feel of the pen on the paper. I like it. I write on college ruled legal pads, and so you know, when I start, I have 8 of them. That makes a book, 400 handwritten pages. And I look at the stack of books and of pads, and I number them 1 to 50, 51 to, 100, all the way through. And I think, look how small that little stack of books, that little stack of pages is. It's not so hard. I always have to trick myself at the beginning to think it's not going to be hard.
Well, okay, I want to really dive deeper in this process. So, when you sit down to write, do you already have the story outlined?
Not exactly. So I'm most interested in character and language. So structure is not my strong suit, but I have learned to impose structure on my story very early. And I shamelessly steal from the masters. So my first novel, Sweetwater, was based on the structure of the Oresteia, which is a series of 3 plays by Aeschylus. And I even used the same name, variations on, Orestes in my novel is Horace, Clytemnestra is Clyde, the grandmother, the matriarch of the family, all the way down. And nobody picked up on this except one reviewer who realized what I was doing. But that structure really helped me because I had a framework for my story. And nobody ever knew. I mean, that book is set in the South, in the 90s, contemporary at the time. So it was not at all, set in Greece or anything. And so I've kind of done that with my books. And this novel, The Exiles, for the first time, I used Joseph Campbell's The 12 Stages of the Hero's Journey. And I pretty much stuck to it, actually.
Wow.
I have 3 characters that the novel moves through, and the hero's journey goes through all 3. So instead of one person, one hero going on his journey, I have these 3 women, and one sort of passes the baton to the next and then to the next. And that was how I envisioned it. So, I had studied Joseph Campbell. I took tons of notes on the different aspects of when things happen in this way. And then I hammered out a 50-page single-spaced document that was sort of, after I'd done a ton of research, that was sort of how the story would unfold, starting with a governess in London who, a classic fish out of water, meaning a character who is thrust into a situation that has nothing to do with the way they live and who they are. So she's a governess. She, in some ways, for me, she did a lot of legwork in that she is a stand-in for the reader. She herself is a reader. She loves books. She's literate. She's studied poetry, etc. And I thought a lot of people who read novels like this probably are in that category. And what I liked about her is that these events happened quickly and precipitously, and she sort of tumbled down a hole. She tumbled into Hades, literally down the steps into Newgate Prison. And it was such a rude awakening. There's a 1-minute scene I sometimes read where, and the last line of it is, she realized that she was about to learn what it was basically to be despised, and that she'd never experienced that before. To be contemptible, I think is the word I used. And so Evangeline, everything that happens to her is a fresh shock, and the reader is sort of pulled along in that. Everything that happens to the reader in the book is a shock. And then eventually Hazel takes over, and Hazel is scrappy and street smart, and nothing is a shock to her. This is her life. This is the world she knew. But what Hazel has that Evangeline doesn't have is that she's got this superpower. She can survive. She has the tools. She has a tradable skill that people want. She's a midwife. Yes. She knows what she's doing. And so she has this strong will to get through. And that pulls you through the second part of the story. Anyway, this is a very long answer to your question, but I guess my point, what I'm trying to say is I did have a plan. I deviated from the plan in ways. Actually, you know what's interesting? This book has been optioned for a series to be on Netflix or whatever. And the producers, when they bought it, it's this all-female production team, which is very exciting and fun. And I'm an executive producer also. But we were talking about ways that the story will expand, because if you have 10 weeks of a series, it will be more going on than is in a 300-page novel, 350-page novel. And I realized I had this amazing 50-page document with all these storylines that I hadn't fully explored. So I sent it to them and they were like, wow, this is great. All this other material, other characters that ended up being cut from the story, you know, all this stuff. So there was a lot more material. I had to hone it.
All right, so I'm going to jump ahead. I actually have an outline, but that's okay. I'll come back to my previous point. So let's talk about your TV project. So you have like 3 of them going on right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, COVID is kind of yeah, but
yes, but what are the 2 other projects that you have optioned?
So in my view, actually, the Exiles, I just have such a strong sense that it's these people. So the team who bought it did Big Little Lies and Gone Girl and Wild. And when they bought this, they said, we don't buy things unless we produce them. And actually they have a new show that just premiered on Sunday on HBO, which is my friend Jean Korelitz's novel. It's called The Undoing with Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant. It's great, by the way. I highly suggest that you watch it.
Is it great? I read mixed reviews, but that's all right.
I think it's wonderful. I mean, I'm a little biased because obviously these are the people who are going to be working on my book. But so yeah, so Orphan Train, Piece of the World, and Exiles have all been optioned. Orphan Train keeps seeming like it's taken off. It's a theatrical movie, but COVID just has wreaked havoc. So it feels a little stalled. But this team is moving ahead, and we're having a big meeting on Thursday. And so I'll let you know, Lincoln, what happens. I'll keep you updated.
All right. So I want to go back to my outline. I have actually an outline. So I'm not gonna use hackneyed phrases like historic fiction or whatever you want to call it. All right. But I do want to delve into, I mean, there are parts of your book that, I mean, Martina was a real person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And so how do you mix fiction with history? Mm-hmm. How do you assemble that?
Well, the issue of Martina is a really complicated one, was for me. I So I went to Australia twice to do research. I had been there in my 20s as a Rotary Fellow, actually, Rotary Foundation Fellow, for 6 weeks. And it was part of what sparked my interest. I mean, well, it obviously did spark my interest in Australia. And I'd never been back until I started researching this novel. And the first time I went, I learned that the 1840s, which is my period that I write about, it's essentially, the novel mostly takes place over 4 years, from 1840 to 1844. And then we jump ahead until the late 1860s. But I learned that that period was at the same time that the convict women were being brought over and all of this stuff was happening. The Aboriginal people were being displaced, were being shoved off their land by the British. And essentially in Tasmania, they were sent to this open air penal colony. Basically, it was basically a prison. Some call it a concentration camp, where most of them died. And there's a question about whether what happened to the Aboriginal people was genocide. But the fact is that when the British landed in 1803 in Tasmania, there were thousands of Aboriginal people living there. And by 1865, the last full-blooded Aboriginal person was dead, just gone. And so it was just a terrible period. There was the Black War that happened in the 1820s and 30s. And the British had just decided that they weren't going to put up with them at all, and that they were going to take over their hunting ground and leave them they had no rights, no land. And so I felt that it would be irresponsible not to address the story. And I discovered that Mathina, this girl, was a real person who was taken in. She was the daughter of a chieftain who was taken in by the governor of Hobart, Tasmania, and his wife, Lady Jane, and Sir John Franklin, who is a real life famous explorer who then disappeared in the Arctic with his crew. They may have eaten each other. There are all kinds of stories that I've read. But Sir John Franklin and Lady Jane took Mathina in, and she was this beautiful, talented, smart 5-year-old. In my novel, she's 8 to 11, but she was 5 in the real story. And as a social experiment. And then they abandoned her and went back to London. And she wandered between worlds. She had lost her own language and couldn't really be back with her own people. And the white people were prejudiced and horrible. So she had a hard life. And I wrote about her in the book. And so essentially, the Franklins and Mathina and all of that is mostly true. The things that happened to her in the book happened to her in real life. But in my story, she interacts with my fictional characters. And that's a little complicated, but it seemed plausible to me that she would.
I want to go back to the subject I raised earlier about how you write by hand. I could have read another 100 pages of the Exiles. I was so absorbed in it. Does your writing a book by hand limit its scope, its range, or do you just have a limit, a physical limit?
You know, it's interesting. I think this is my longest book.
It is, yes. Most of your books are around 300 pages?
Yeah. I'm a ruthless editor, and I just cut and cut and cut. But I also write short, meaning I have friends who write 1,000 pages to end up with a 400-page book. And I tend to have to add. I write a draft and then I add on to it. One thing, I've worked with my editor at HarperCollins for quite a long time, and we've noticed patterns over the years. One is that I need to expand in certain places, and another is that it takes a while for the story to get going. So part of her job is often to like trim the beginning and add on to the later part. But, you know, I don't know, Lincoln, I sort of value, I don't want to bog down. So maybe that's part of it. I don't think anyone's ever quite asked me that, and I don't quite know how to answer. I don't write really long books. My books are all about 300 pages.
Correct. So, and
You think I need to be more ambitious and write a longer book?
well, forgive me for this, but when I finished the book, I had the same postpartum feeling as I did when I finished the Game of Thrones. Now, I apologize for comparing your work to the Game of Thrones, but you know, I could have read more. I was so involved with the characters that I could, yeah. It's, you know, it's just as simple as that. By the way, the minor characters were also great. Olive, was that her name?
Yes, Olive Rivers.
She was amazing. I think I could have read more about Ruby.
You're driving me to drink, so I'm
I apologize. But
no, I'm kidding. So
I'm sorry. We should probably explain to
yeah,
the listeners what we're talking about here.
Right. Okay, so the three main characters are Evangeline, Hazel, and Mathina. And then there are these secondary characters, some of whom have large personalities themselves.
Yeah.
So this was very fun. I'm going to tell you two stories very fast. One is about Olive Rivers. So I wrote A Piece of the World, which, as I told you, was all about real people.
Right.
And in real life, Christina Olsen had a frenemy, a friend who's really an enemy, who was always undermining her and saying kind of mean things. And you know, I read different accounts of this relationship, and here's what actually eventually happened. Christina's brother, his wife, was having a baby, and it was in the house that they all lived in, the house that's in the Painting Christina's world. And so Olive Rivers, Christina's friend, came over that morning to help, and Christina was sitting in the kitchen not doing anything. She didn't even light the fire. And Olive said, "What are you doing? Get up, your brothers, they're having a baby, we've got to celebrate." Christina was distraught because her own love affair had ended poorly. And it was sort of her realization that she would never have a child, probably of her own, or a relationship of her own. And she was having her feelings about that. But Olive Rivers kept pushing her and saying, "You got to get up." And Christina said, "If you say one more word to me about this, I will never speak to you again." And Olive said, "Oh, don't be ridiculous." And Christina Olsen never spoke to her again. They lived in this town, there's 60 people, and she would cross to the other side of the road. I mean, never spoke to her again. How does that happen? So in the novel, I realized I needed the reader to understand why she would never speak to her again. So I made her perhaps even more undermining than she was in real life. I'm not sure, because I had scant material to go on. But when I turned it in eventually, and when we were going through first pass, which is once it is typeset and everything, my editor and I were chatting about it. And I said, you know, I kind of wonder if we should change that name. And she said, "I know what you mean. Or if her Olive Rivers relatives might not be happy about this." So it's the only name I changed in the book. I changed her name to Gertrude Gibbons, which I love as a name, but I always loved the name Olive Rivers, and I was sad to give it up. So I gave that name to one of my favorite characters in the Exiles. God, was this such a boring story? I don't know why I told you the story, but I find it entertaining.
That's how you the name.
About a writer's methodology or something. Anyway, so I gave that name to the character in The Exiles, who's this bawdy, truth-telling. She was such a great character for me because she did a lot of the heavy lifting. I'm sort of telling you the writery version of this story, which is that you always So in the case of this story, I needed to convey some factual information that was kind of dry but important about the convict women being sent over as breeders to Australia, all of this. So Olive was able, through humor, as this character, was able to be the vehicle for that kind of stuff. She was always telling this naive governess the lay of the land. She was always explaining what was going on. And that was really an explanation to the reader as well about what was going on. So she was terrific. And I'll just say one more thing about her and about the surgeon and a few other characters in the novel. In Art of the Novel, E.M. Forster talks about round characters, which of course your central characters, you want to be round. They live, they breathe, they are multifaceted, they surprise you, etc. But you also need flat characters, and they're very important in a novel. And your flat characters have sort of one track, because you can't have a novel filled with 20 round characters. It's too much. You can't keep track of them all. And your flat characters are easily defined. They're often funny. They're often foils to the main characters. And so in this novel, I actually read that after I wrote Exiles, and I realized that's exactly what this is, that I have several characters who do some of the heavy lifting and fill certain roles in the book. And they allow my central characters to be rounded and complex, I hope.
Oh, well, I should just clarify that Christina, is it Christina Olsen? Right?
Yes.
She is the figure in the famous Andrew Wyeth painting, and that was the character in your book. And I want to ask you, and no spoilers here, tell me about your new projects, and I also want to know what is your day like? What do you read? How do you work?
Well, right now I just moved, so I haven't been working much. I'm not writing at the moment. I'm researching my new novel, which yet again is set in the past. I don't know what the heck I'm doing. It's so much work. Speaking of Lily King, and when I did an event with her last month, some of you may have seen it, but I said, we were talking about writing research heavy books because she just wrote Euphoria. That was her novel before the new one. And I said, well, but this new one, you must have done research. I mean, it took place in the 90s. You don't remember everything. And she was like, yes, I do. I did no research for this book. It was much easier. I don't know what you're doing writing these books that are set in the past. It's like, I did that. I'm done with that. Too much work. So I hope at some point to get back to writing contemporary fiction. But my next novel is set in Civil War era North Carolina, and it's based on a family story. And yet again, I'm entering some crazy world filled with insane history buffs who know everything. I mean, I took a tour of Gettysburg with a Civil War guy, the head guide, and his level of knowledge about every arcane detail was horrifyingly precise. So I think I'm just wading into a terrible disaster, but we'll see. It's a family story that's so wild. I could not not do it. So I'm doing.
So tell me about, okay, so you're not working on, I mean, your promotional schedule right now is amazing. I mean, you're doing one of these almost every night, which is, to me, the fatigue must be incredible.
Well, it's really just that I have to put on mascara, which sucks.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Yeah.
And I had to
shave.
You have to shave. You have to take a shower. It impedes my lifestyle. Yes, wash my hair and stuff. Put on a presentable, take off my sweatshirt that I live in. That's the hard part. Yeah, no, I'm doing about 3 things a day that are book related. So like this afternoon, I did an interview for a New York newspaper, and earlier than that, I had to make a video for a thing. Anyway, I'm just like that kind of silly stuff that is part of promoting a book. In the first few months after a book comes out, you just are in that world. So I'm doing a lot of that stuff. I am reading some great books. Actually, let me show you this. This is not out yet. I'm blurbing it. It's beautiful. It's called What's Mine and Yours, Naima Koster. She was my student. She went to Yale, and then she did an MFA, and her first book is great. But this book is a breakout. Like, it's being published by a big press. They're doing a big push for it. She's African-American, and the story is
up again. Can we look at it?
It's quite political.
Well, what's mine and yours?
And yours. And the pub date, wait a second, let me pull my glasses. The pub date is March 2nd. What's Mine and Yours. And mark my words, it's a wonderful book, and we'll be getting some good, well-deserved applause, I think. And so I've been blurbing a few books, and also I'm reading Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which is
wow. Okay.
Yeah. And reading Heather Cox Richardson, reading Lincoln Millstein, both of whom are keeping me up to date on politics and the state of the world. Heather Cox Richardson, for those of you out there who don't know her, is a Boston University professor who's just incredible. And she has a blog about politics, and she posts every single day. And she has this broad view about what's going on in the country right now. And it's so brilliant. She writes it at 3 a.m. and I often, like a dog now, I wake up at 4, read her column, go back to sleep. It's kind of ridiculous, but yeah. And Lincoln, whenever you send out a Quietside newsletter that says breaking news, it's the first thing I have to open it that minute.
So how are we doing, Marian? Are there questions? Or shall
here. Yes, there is one. I'm going to read it. I see it on the question thing. Okay. So Janet Clifford asks, in your research of England and Australian life during the time period of your novel, did you find any local digital archives similar to the one at Southwest Harbor Public Library that were especially helpful? And were they housed at libraries, museums, or historical societies? That is a very good question. So I found, first of all, I befriended, I should say I stalked a historian named Alison Alexander. I discovered her online. She's written 33 books about Australian history, in particular convict history, and her specialty is convict women and Lady Jane Franklin. She's written biographies of her. So she's in her 70s, and I reached out to her through her website. I ordered her books, which are not available in America, and then I descended on her when I went to Australia, and she ended up making dinner for me and my sister Cynthia every night at her house, and her lovely husband James, who we would have roast beast for dinner and things like that, with very English. But she was amazing, and she connected me with all sorts of resources, contemporaneous materials. I read most of her books, which were all about this period. And then there are all these archives online. I became a member of academia.org, I think it's called. So I had access to many pieces about Aboriginal history through that. There's a lot of research and a lot of scholarship at the moment that is exciting to see. And so I was able to delve into that. I also worked with a professor of Aboriginal studies at the University of Tasmania, who himself is descended from an Aboriginal tribe. And he was really helpful and read the manuscript more than once. So did Alison Alexander. So I had a lot of fact checking. And then I had a sensitivity reader, and then I had a media trainer. There were all these bits and pieces of the process of writing about this fraught period of history.
I just reminded myself, we're talking to our neighbors. This is a very special session because we're talking to local people. And I just reminded myself that about your article in the New York Times in 2016 on August 14th. You can go and look and Google it, where you wrote about your sisters and how you all live in Southwest Harbor.
Yeah.
Please look that up, everybody. I think most of you probably have already read it, but it's a great signature piece about your sisters, Cynthia, Clara, and Catherine, right?
Yes.
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 Please read that piece.
That piece was about how we got to Southwest Harbor and how we stayed here. And now the house I've moved to is, I said we all live within 2 miles of each other. I now live down the road from two of them. And one of us now is stuck a mile away or whatever it is, 2 miles away, a 5-minute drive, which is very vexing to her that she's on the outside. But yeah, we're here, and actually all of us have been here since March. So it's been a very unusual time. I have an apartment in New York City. My husband and I and my sister, Catherine, my youngest sister, lives there with her family. They have 3 children, 3 boys, and she and her husband live there. And we live 10 blocks apart in New York City. So we have this wonderful dual relationship,
Yeah.
partly in the city and partly here. But at the moment, we're all here. We're just here, like everyone, bunkered in.
Can we take one more question? Is there one more? Are there any questions left?
Let's see if there's anything left. Does anyone have a question?
There's one from Susan Baylor Kelly there. Susan, it's, here it is. I listened to books. It came in at 5:43.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that?
Yes, I'll do it. I listen to books on Audible, and so far I found your narrators amazing. Oh, that's great to hear. Narration can make or break my experience when listening to a book. Are you involved with choosing the talent? Yes, I'm obsessed with this because I know how important it is. We, for 20 years, lived in Montclair, New Jersey, and my husband plays hockey with and became friends with the head of audible.com, which is the great audio place. It's the organization that essentially popularized books on tape, which became audiobooks. His name is Don Katz, and I've had many conversations with him about how important the reader is. So for Orphan Train, we got dozens of people reading the same page. That's how it works. You get like 20 people reading the same page. And I found this reader, Jessica Almazzi, who just is spectacular. She does all the voices, and I think she's wonderful. And she's definitely part of the success of that book. And then for the Exiles, my publisher sent me a bunch of voices. I didn't like any of them. And I went down a rabbit hole of finding great voices who could do Scotland, London, Cockney, sort of high class, bottom of the ladder, and then Australia as well. And so I found this incredible reader, Caroline Lee, who lives in Sydney. She's a Shakespeare actress. And she's narrated all of Liane Moriarty's books and Kate Morton's books. And I just think her voice is spectacular. And I often hate listening to my own audiobooks, the way many writers don't like to read their own work. I always want to edit my work. But Caroline Lee is so talented that I forget that I wrote the words. So I highly recommend the audiobook for that. And yes, they've been very kind to let me nose in. As you can tell, I want to have some control over the process. So
as we get over this pandemic, Christina and I have already talked about getting everybody together. We'll play music, we'll talk about books, we'll socialize, we'll drink wine, we'll have a great time in Southwest Harbor. We'll pick a nice venue.
Yes.
And so I'm looking forward to that.
We want to have a literary and artistic celebration.
Yes.
musical. Yes.
We are all going to look forward to that, that's for sure. It's been so wonderful having both of you. This has been a real treat. I just finished, I was at the same time reading The Exiles and listening to A Piece of the World at the same time. And I'd read Orphan Train long ago, but it just, what a gift you give to all of us with your work. And you too, Lincoln, with the Quietside Journal. I'm with you. And I listened to Heather as well. Yeah. So we're all going to get through this.
We're all going to get through this.
Yeah.
Well, in a time like this, when we're so atomized and can't see many people, just Lincoln, having your presence in my inbox is such a big deal. With the Southwest Harbor Library, Marianne, I'm constantly dropping off books, picking up books. It's just been such a wonderful heart of this community. And I just really appreciate what you do so much. So,
well, I think we're all lucky to be here.
Yeah.
You know, I remember when you got here in March, seeing you around the corner, and now you're just up the road a piece. But
Exactly.
yeah. So.
Well, thank you both so much.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, have a good
This
night.
has really, really been a special evening, and thanks so much. And everybody stay safe and keep your sense of humor, stay sane, and
Definitely.
we'll get through it.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Good night.